All right, my name is Sarah, and I'm the Director of Events and Product Marketing with VHA. This is our third webinar in our series of 9. So be sure to check back on our website to see the upcoming events. And as we open up registration, you'll see the dates come live. So I would like to introduce Dr. Rebecca McComas. She's the owner of Minnesota Pets, one of our local Twin Cities home euthanasia practices. She's joining us today to share some of what she's learned over the last 10 years about providing excellent end-of-life care, and will be giving us some tips on how to hopefully come to enjoy helping clients when a pet reaches the end of life. Christy Lehman is the Vice President of Minnesota Pets and is a licensed social worker. She has been doing veterinary social work for 8 years and has been with Minnesota Pets for 7 years. She's excited to be here to share her knowledge about supporting clients through the euthanasia experience and how to take care of your own well-being through the process as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. So I am so excited about this talk. This is my favorite topic to cover, and so I'm very glad that you're joining us. And throughout the PowerPoint, if you have questions or comments or real-world examples, definitely feel free to pop into the chat and let us know. We can stop and cover all of those things that come up. I think for this topic, it's especially important to do that when it feels right, because when you're hearing some of the things that we're talking about, you might be thinking, well, that doesn't feel appropriate in this situation, or that doesn't feel right for my role. And it's really hard to cover a topic this vast and make it appropriate, specifically for every role. And so those are the things that we can, stop and talk through a little bit too. So if something like that crosses your mind, feel free to interrupt at any time. We welcome that. So I just wanted to say a few things about Minnesota Pets for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We are one of the local in-home euthanasia practices, like Sarah said. We focus on euthanasia and cremation, so we provide in-home euthanasia visits and cremation transportation. We also do the pickup of deceased pets for cremation, which we work with VHA on. So we provide those sorts of services too. If you have a client who calls your practice because their pet passed away at home, that's something that our team can help with. So you can encourage your clients to give us a call if they need support with the cremation and transportation. And then we also provide quality of life assessments. Right now, our in-home quality of life assessments are on hold due to COVID. That's really the only service that we provide that's on hold due to COVID, but we do provide lots of consultation and phone discussions with our entire support team. So clients are still encouraged to call us and talk to us about that, and there's no fee for those phone conversations. We are also a member of the IHPC, which is the International Association for Animal Hospice and Palliative Care. And so that's an international organization that we're pretty heavily involved in. We go to the annual conference, and it's all geared, of course, toward hospice and in-home euthanasia care with lots of other mobile providers. So we have a big network we learn a lot from. And some of what we even talk about today, we've shared with them or learned from them. So if you're interested in end-of-life care, I encourage you to check out that organization. So what we're going to talk about, and I'm sorry, I keep looking at my other screen because I've got 2 screens up, so I'm trying to get used to that setup. But the things that we're going to cover today are the relationship between kids and their companion animals, which is probably so clear to all of you, but I just want to say a few words about it to set the stage. General overview of grief and how kids of different ages grieve and kind of understand and process death and loss. And then your role as a veterinary professional, depending on if you're a CVT or a receptionist or a veterinarian, hopefully everything we cover in this talk is applicable in some way to your role. And then specific language for discussing topics with kids. We're going to talk a lot about language. That's the whole kind of topic of this talk is like language that we use with kids, the words we use. And the reason we're talking so much about that is because we have found that so much of our stress that we feel when working with families and working with kids comes from, the questions that they ask and getting stuck trying to figure out how to describe things in a way that would make sense to a child, or when parents ask us what they should say. So we're going to cover a lot of that and hopefully give a lot of concrete sentences and phrasing that you can use and kind of keep in your back pocket or share with your team. I will also say I have a lot of words on my PowerPoint. I always break the golden rule of PowerPoints and I have too much text. And I do that partly because then it's there and it's available for you if you need it. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint so that you can see all of the text, I am happy to send that to you. I'll have my email at the end because I have some printable resources that I can send. So that's also one of them, is the PowerPoint slides themselves so that you can see the sentences. So when we talk about kids and pet loss, this is a picture of me with my cat when I was little, who clearly wasn't enjoying our interaction as much as I was, but longitudinal research shows that kids have a stronger bond with their pets oftentimes than even with their own siblings, which I think is really telling of that sort of intimate relationship that they have. And I think we all know that. We've all been kids probably who loved pets, which is why we're all in this field, I'm sure. Or we have kids who love pets. So I feel like on a gut level, this really makes sense to us. But I think it's important for us to remember, especially when it comes to a pet's end of life. So kids, especially kids who are facing adversity, are highly likely to turn to their pets for even more so than their peers. So even more so than their friends at school, they kind of look to their pets as that social support, of course, probably without even realizing it, especially if they're young kids. So that's really important to think about as they're facing that loss. And for many kids, losing a pet is their first experience with grief and their first experience with death and loss. And so it is a heartbreaking time for them, and of course for the parents who are also, guiding them through it and guiding themselves through it. But it's also such an opportunity for them to learn about loss in a healthy way and learn some coping skills that they can use, through their whole life. So I think it is really an opportunity for us to help parents and for parents to help their kids through that. And if there's one takeaway for this entire talk, it's that kids deserve support and honesty. And so I'm going to dig into that a ton. That'll be a huge part of this talk. But if there's one thing to walk away with, and if there's one thing to answer when a parent asks how they should support their kids, it's that they deserve honesty and they need that support. And I think a lot of times we tiptoe around, how to tell kids what's going on, or how to tell them in a way that doesn't, make them feel worse than they feel. And really that honesty is most important for them when they're grieving. So we'll get into that a lot too. So this is one of my slides with a lot of words. So I do have this in a printable form. If you would like it for yourself or for your team, I'm happy to email it, and I'll put my email at the end. This is just a breakdown of the different ages and just sort of how they process loss and death. I think this is really important for a couple of reasons. We can this is even a handout that we can give parents. At Minnesota Pets, we make this available for parents, and it's helpful because a lot of what we see from kids is not what we would expect to see. They either seem like they're more upset than we were expecting, or sometimes they seem like less upset than we were expecting. And parents tend to worry, is this normal? Is this an appropriate reaction? Do I need to do something about this? And so this just kind of breaks down what we can expect, and it's variable, and just because a certain child kind of lands in an age group doesn't mean developmentally they process it the same. And so it varies a lot, but this is a very good general breakdown. One of the things I want to point out, there are a couple of milestones. I do want to mention that even though infants clearly don't understand the process of grief and loss and that sort of thing, they don't know what's happening in the same way that an older child would. I do want to point out that research has shown that infants, even as young as 4 months, recognize emotional expression, and they can kind of sense or feel their parents' grief in certain ways depending on their age. And so that might come into play if a parent has their infant present, which we're seeing, especially right now at Minnesota Pets, because childcare is often closed. And so children who are younger are often present when before they wouldn't have been, because a parent would have chosen to have them in childcare. So that's just something that we have learned through research. And in those situations, parents can be encouraged to just use very soft, reassuring voices and movements to kind of create and cultivate that safe space for infants. The other milestone that I want to point out is that around age 9 or so, that's when a really big shift tends to happen. And this is where a lot of unexpected behavior can come from that worries parents sometimes. But around that age 9, oftentimes that's when children are starting to realize that death is permanent. So it becomes something that is less abstract and something that is like, oh, well, Buddy went to sleep. He'll wake up someday and we'll play again. Now I'm going to go play with my toys and not feel, kind of stuck in this. That's like a typical younger child reaction. An older child around 8 or 9 or 10, they are really understanding now that death means that someone is gone and they're not coming back. And so it's sort of a difficult transition for them. Of course, they have to process what that means. And that's where a different level of grief, often more resembling what we would experience as an adult, happens. And so that's important to know. Kids can often kind of have explosive behavior or ask really interesting, morbid questions that worry parents a lot, and that is totally normal. So having something like this available for parents as a printout or folded up in a condolence card, which we'll talk a little bit more about how to deliver these recommendations, but that can be really helpful just to help normalize, what they're seeing in their child. So your role when you are leading people through this, and I'm going to have Rebecca jump in on this one too, because her role in helping families through this has been very different than my role. And so when you are there with the family, I know it can sort of feel like, well, how much should I step in? How much should I, be a fly on the wall? And so, Rebecca, do you want to share a little bit about what your experience has been as a veterinarian in the home through these visits?
Sure, absolutely. And I think even just to take a step back for a moment, when I approach a family, when it's time for euthanasia, and I know that children of whatever age are going to be involved, I really draw on my personal experience because I am a parent, so I have children, but maybe some of the people who are on our call today don't have any children, and there isn't that personal experience with their own, but certainly there are kids that you have known over time. So whether it's nieces and nephews or neighbors or friends or whatever, sometimes kids' conversation can feel sort of uncomfortable because it's not very familiar. So I would really encourage you, it's not going to happen this holiday season, but when we can and we get back together again with our families and other acquaintances that we have, spend some time with the kids and just start kind of hanging out with them if you haven't done that before, because it just really helps to build sort of a familiarity with those different age groups. And you'll have this much better sense about what a 7 or 8-year-old is thinking about versus what maybe a later teen is thinking about. And we're not that far away from being a teenager, but they're really, really different creatures. And their emotional experience during a euthanasia appointment runs the whole entire spectrum from hardly seeming to notice what's going on to being so overwhelmed and like completely swamped by the feelings that they're experiencing, especially for those teens. They feel it really intensely, whereas you might have a 7 or 8-year-old who's just so curious about your syringes and your needles, and they're not even seeming to grasp at all kind of the fact that this is the last time that they're going to see their pet. So it really runs a very broad spectrum. And honestly, I love the appointments that have kids because I find that the kids being there are sort of a conduit for everyone in the room to understand, because it feels more normal in our society to explain something in a basic level to a child, but really everyone in the room benefits from basic explanations. And so I think it's really an opportunity. It's a great opportunity. So I love it. If you haven't spent much time with kids, just start doing that. Any coaching opportunities, stuff like that is great. Relating specifically to this slide, when I was looking over what things you had put on this list, it is a really good list. This is exactly the sort of roles that you're going to find yourself playing. And it often depends on the family dynamic. Some parents seem like they've done a lot of preparation with the child in advance, and there isn't this sense of uncertainty. But other families that you get together with, I don't think the parents know what to say, and they haven't said much of anything, and it's almost like they look at you sort of desperate. Can you explain what's going on? because we have not been able to do that. So it will, again, you'll take on different roles, but here's some of the ones that I most commonly have experienced. Often it's a death education about what is an animal who is no longer alive, whose heart is no longer beating and they're not breathing anymore. Kids do have an intense curiosity about that, and I like to encourage them to just really look and take it in. Finding ways to do that in the clinic if possible, if there's space and time to do that. Really encourage them to touch and to get close. What does your pet feel like? Does your dog feel any different? Does he smell any different? You know, his body is pretty much the same, but you can tell he's no longer there. And so there's good words coming up later in this presentation too, that will help. But that curiosity is something that I think is supernatural. It's not weird and morbid at all. It's just them expressing something that they haven't experienced before. Let's see what else. Oh, I think the most important role is the supporter of the parents. Often, especially with those teenagers and early 20s, they don't agree with the decision. And I know if you've been in practice for a little while, you have seen this happen. I think there's this sense of hopefulness maybe that we have when we're a lot younger. We don't have any experience with making end-of-life decisions. Maybe the parents have been through this before long ago when the kids were not even old enough to know what was going on. Parents really benefit from your advocacy of their decision and saying in really clear terms, you have made the right choice. This is one of those situations where there isn't any hope. And kind of that, it's hard to dispel somebody's sense of hopefulness, but you know that in many of our patients, there isn't that sense of hope. So validating the parent's choice is really important to do. And then finally, I'll comment just on the one about role models. We are always a role model, even if we're not thinking of ourselves in that term. When I was little and I was growing up, we had a family pet, just like so many of us in this profession. And our veterinarian was this really classic kind of white-haired older man. And he was so gentle and so kind. And he didn't know me from Adam. We never even really had a conversation, but every time I brought my dog in, or I was there with my parents, I observed what he was doing. And honestly, that played a role in me joining this profession. And I know that's true for many of you as well. So you are a role model, whether you want to be a role model or whether you think of yourself as a role model, you are. And so just kind of keeping that in the back of your mind, I think is helpful. I could go on and on because the roles that you play vary and change a lot, but at least those are some of the more common ones that I experience.
Yes, and I feel like if you're ever in a situation, let's say you're getting a family settled into the exam room and they're about to say goodbye and you're just not quite sure, you know, you feel like there should be a role that you're playing or you're not quite sure how to, you know, best fit this situation, it's always okay, you know, to ask and to say, what can I do to help most right now? And sometimes families will say, no, that's okay. And sometimes they're not expecting a question like that. They expect the veterinary professionals to just really be focused on their pet. And so for them to be asked, you know, how they can be helped might be surprising to them and pleasantly surprising, hopefully. But don't ever be afraid to ask, you know, what you can do to help or what role you can play to support them. And I just wanted to, let's see, I wanted to include this slide because sometimes when we talk about creating a space when a family is saying goodbye to a pet, we have talked before about creating a physical space. I think at the last talk we talked about, you know, preparing the exam room or giving some thought to, you know, the environment that the family is in. But I want you to kind of think about a different type of space the next time that you're helping someone say goodbye, especially a family with kids. It's really important to hold space, which is a very abstract social worky term. So I wanted to break it down and just describe that it means that you're physically, mentally, and emotionally present for someone. And you're putting your focus on them, supporting them as they feel whatever feelings they have. So if, especially a family with kids, the child might be a little bit withdrawn in the visit, or they may be angry, or they may not even be, you know, they may just be looking for the crayons and wondering what the fuss is about. And So whatever is happening with that family, being present with them and focused on them, even just for a few minutes, even just while you're in that room with them, is really important. And they can feel that, and it creates a space for them to grieve as a family however they need to. It's a way for you to kind of withhold judgment and focus on them and set the tone for a kind and curious and judgment-free interaction, which is especially important when kids are present. We want kids to feel safe being curious when something like this is happening, because if they have a question, we want them to ask it so that the parents or we can answer it for them. Oftentimes what they're imagining or what they're worried about is actually worse than what is going to happen. We tell parents that often when they're wondering if their child should be present for euthanasia. If a child knows that a doctor is going to come in and help their pet die, how they imagine that to happen may be much worse than what really happens. You know, we know that it's peaceful, we know that it can be beautiful and they'll be there, but depending on what type of movies they've seen or what they've known from, you know, friends at school, they may be picturing something very different. And so creating a space for them to ask questions, not feel silly, feel whatever they're feeling is really important. And so the next time you're in a visit, and it wouldn't even need to be just euthanasia, I would encourage you to kind of keep this in mind as an intention for any sort of difficult visit, even one where you're, you know, delivering bad news or having a tough conversation. Just kind of leaving everything else outside that exam room door and just being present with them and creating a space for them is one of the most therapeutic, helpful things that you can do without even saying anything special to them.
You know, Christy, let me add one more thing to that too. In a practical sense, I would never have called it holding space because I wouldn't have known that term until I have gotten to know you. And the teaching and training that you've done for us over the years. I find that holding space is a nonverbal thing in a lot of ways. So sometimes in an exam room or in a home visit, we can find ways to keep ourselves busy with something. Like you can be putting together your supplies, or you can be assembling a packet for them, or it feels like in a way we're giving them some space because we're not talking and we're not right in their face. But instead of doing that for the whole time, finding some times where you are still quiet, you're not talking, you don't need to be saying anything. There are quiet moments, whether you're waiting for the sedative to take effect or if the pet has already passed away and you're just kind of letting everyone take it all in. We don't need to be talking about anything. But what I will often do is just kind of sit calmly and make eye contact. Just allow eye contact with whoever's in the room. And especially for kids. And sometimes they're just looking at you like, is this really weird? And should I be really scared? And if you are sitting quietly, sort of with a gentle smile on your face, maybe it does, you know, it's not a giddy moment, but it certainly doesn't have to be a terrible moment. It just gives people the opportunity to say something if they needed to, or to just feel some support without feeling like you have disengaged. It's a way, I guess, of saying to stay engaged without having to blah, 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 talk about something, because sometimes silence is quite lovely. And that is the space that people need. Anyway, it's just something I found myself doing a lot, but I wouldn't have called it that. I didn't know that was what it was called.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it was important to mention this because we talk a lot in the rest of the presentation about the words that we use and, you know, how we explain things, and that matters so much, but also just not saying anything sometimes really is what is helpful for people. And so kind of giving yourself that freedom to take a step back and not feel that you have to fill every piece of silence. It takes some of the pressure off of you, and it just creates a space for them, which is really important. So I think for this one, Rebecca, do you want to talk a little bit, you mentioned the role depending on the family's needs changing. Do you want to talk a little bit about the survey that we've done?
Yes. So when we do home visits, we always, in our post-appointment email, we will send the client an invitation to participate in a survey. It's a very low pressure sort of invitation, but we love to hear about how their experience was, and if they have any sort of moments in that experience where they would like for, I don't know, just if it could have been done differently. So one thing that we just hear all the time that never varies, and it isn't something that they've ever asked us to do differently, is that explaining the process to them is super helpful. And this becomes especially important with kids because parents don't even have the words a lot of times to explain. Questions come up that, like, what are you doing at each of those steps? I know you've had this experience, many of you, with little kids. They want to know every single thing that you're doing. And just telling them, including them, letting them listen with your stethoscope, just touching the equipment that you have that's safe for them to touch. If you make a paw print, letting the child be a part of that and explaining, here's what we need, and I need for you to use your warm hands to soften up the clay so that we can make an imprint so that you can take it home with you today. Things like that, just explaining, especially kids who have questions about, and I know this is coming up later in the slide, about cremation. Parents don't have the words to describe cremation. And maybe early in your career, you feel too like, I don't have the words to describe cremation either because it's kind of a mysterious process. VHA is so cool because they let you, I don't know, probably aren't doing it during COVID, of course, but after COVID, you can come in for a tour and really see the entire process so that you understand it thoroughly. And Christy has some great words for how to explain cremation in ways that aren't frightening and scary. Parents so often will look at us with this look in their eye like, please help me with this because I don't know what to say about this. And so it's just a part of every one of our every single one of our home appointments. And like I mentioned earlier, it gives you the opportunity to explain things in a basic way without feeling like you're insulting anybody in the room. Talking at a child's level still helps everybody to understand. So yeah, I mean, every client who comments about explaining the process, this is just a super helpful, just a really big part of what it is that you're going to be doing. Also, as far as explaining goes too, we take the approach, and every clinic is going to take their own approach, but our approach is usually to keep things fairly basic and fairly simple, and to not use any words like I need to warn you about, or, you know, it doesn't happen very often, but something might happen. That creates more anxiety than you actually probably need or want during the visit. But if something happens that you need to explain, your calm demeanor and your explanation of what's going on and that this is pretty normal and we see it pretty often usually is enough to help people without having too much of a warning in advance. For example, like agonal breathing, I don't often go into much detail about that. I just say things like, well, his breathing might change during this. It might speed up a little bit, or he might take some deep breaths. So it's not like it's a weird thing. It's just something that you might see, but it's certainly not a warning. Is that what you were thinking too, Christy? Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And so for the last half of this talk, we're going to get a little bit more concrete in terms of how to talk to kids or how to encourage parents to talk to kids. I know that sometimes, you know, we might want to jump in and it might not always be appropriate. And so it's sort of, you know, up to you to kind of read each family and each situation, especially depending on your role. Each role in the clinic is going to be different. A receptionist is going to be talking to the parent, of course, and so they may be answering questions about, you know, well, should I bring my child? Do you have any advice? Is there any articles? Things like that might come up on the phone. And so your receptionist team may benefit from some training about that, or, you know, even sharing some of these slides with them, versus a tech who's maybe getting them settled into the exam room, kind of giving them an overview of what's going to happen, helping them, you know, feel prepared in the space. And then of course the veterinarian's role is unique from all of those roles. So each role is so different, and none of these are, you know, a perfect catch-all. Sometimes you'll be able to share these recommendations with parents, and sometimes they kind of have it under control. And so each situation is so different. But the words that we use when we talk about death to kids are very important. They're very literal creatures and they have vivid imaginations. And so it's really important to say what we mean, even when it's difficult for us. And before I get into the details of that, I just want to mention too that we are so socialized to use euphemisms and like the most gentle language we can when it comes to death when we talk to adults or when adults talk to each other. I can't even tell you how many times clients call and they almost never say, I need to schedule a euthanasia. They say, I need to help my pet over the rainbow bridge. I need to let him go. I need to help her transition. I mean, we are very creative in thinking of every possible way of describing death without having to say words like death or euthanize, which is very normal and common, when we're talking with adults. When we talk to kids, we have to sort of shift that, which is a huge paradigm shift, I know, because it's so against what we've become used to. But we really want to get into the habit of using those clear, concrete words so that there's no guessing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's why for kids, words are so important and they matter so much. So we're going to talk about euthanasia, cremation, cremains, and burial. So we'll give you some kind of concrete language and phrasing that you can use there, and then how your role might change between kind of pre-visit, during the visit, after the visit. So much of what we know, all of what we know is based on in-home visits. So I realize this will be very different for some clinics depending on your setup and who is involved on the team. And I also know that this is very, very different right now due to COVID, which I'll touch a little bit on. Obviously, right now we are only able to do what we can do and do our best with what we have. And so we're limited in a lot of ways due to COVID. I know many clinics, aren't letting people in and no kids present. And right now, in fact, at Minnesota Pets, we're limiting the number of people present and certain ages. And so it's really a tough time because it goes against everything that we value when it comes to this topic. We want the families to be involved together and have open conversations and be there with each other. And right now, COVID is not allowing that. And so I realize this is a difficult time to have this discussion, but I'm hoping that it gives you some ideas and hope for when COVID is no longer a threat. And hopefully in the future, we can put some of this in action and even some ways that you can think creatively during COVID to involve everyone. So we'll talk about kind of each stage of the process. So I want to mention that at every stage in the process, there is something that you can do that is really helpful and in a way that parents can help their kids too. So whether you are directly, doing this when you're with the family or you're encouraging the parents to, or if you are doing this in your own family, either way, this is an important part that I wanted to share with you. So there's something called affect labeling. And it's just a fancy way of saying naming feelings. This is really important for kids when they're grieving because they just don't often have the words to describe what they're feeling. And when they feel something new and complex and confusing, oftentimes if they don't have the words to describe it, it comes out in behavior. And any parent or aunt or uncle knows that, a toddler who's hungry, if they don't know how to describe that they're hungry, it usually comes out in other ways that aren't as desirable. So this is something that can happen often with grief too, and any real big feeling that a kid has. So naming feelings and helping them with the vocabulary is important, and it's a way we can sort of role model for them. So affect labeling, and I'll also mention that this is really important for adults too. So much of what we talk about for kids is specific to kids right now, like when we have this talk, but really this is something that we can do when we talk to adults, and this is something that I do with clients every day when we talk on the phone. So using lots of feeling words is important. Research shows that affect labeling disrupts amygdala activity, so it results in more adaptive coping and less explosive emotional dysregulation, which can happen with kids often and can sometimes happen with adults too. So helping families name feelings before, during, and after the visit is really important. So the way we can kind of help with that is building our own emotional vocabulary. When we talk with kids, simple words like sadness, heartbreak, those sort of words are important for them. depending on their age, they may not realize that that really heavy feeling in their heart when their parents are crying and their dog is sick is sadness. And so even just saying to them, you know, like, this is so sad, I'm so sorry, I wish this wasn't happening, that's really important to do because it gives them the word. Like, I feel sadness, this is what this is. And so using words like that is really important. When you're talking to adults, we have a more like grown-up feeling word list that we use at Minnesota Pets, that includes, you know, more complex, like devastated, exhausted, paralyzed, numb, those sort of feelings that we don't often say. You know, we say this is really difficult, I know, but to kind of take it to another level and build that feeling word vocabulary really brings that empathy for the client and how you convey it just so much deeper. So there's another level that you can do with adults, of course. But doing this with kids is very important. And this is something that you might want to share with parents. If you have a sort of blog page or resource list, sharing this idea with them can be really helpful. It can be a good way for them to learn this basic way of supporting their child through grief. So when we talk about euthanasia, it's really difficult because some families have, of course, an easier time explaining when their pet is sick, or even if their pet dies on their own, you know, naturally, that may not feel as foreign to them. And, you know, how do we describe it when we're intervening? That is something that can be really hard for parents. And so kind of giving them some suggestions depending on you know, how much they ask or how you can get this to them ahead of time is really helpful. So when we talk to parents at Minnesota Pets, we often have these conversations because they'll let us know on the phone that their children are present. That's something we ask when we schedule the visit. So we know ahead of time if there are children in the family, or, you know, if they'll be present. And so we kind of say to them, is there anything I can do, you know, to give you resources or to help you help your kids through this? And it's sort of like, I didn't even think to ask, you know, for help from your team. And so just offering that is really helpful. And then having a resource pack or having some of these things written out is an easy way for your receptionist team to help get them the information, rather than kind of relying on memory to explain these things, which I know is really difficult if it's not in your wheelhouse. So these are here and you can steal them and you can, you know, make your own resources with these ideas. But when we talk to parents about, you know, talking to their kids about euthanasia, we encourage them to use concrete phrasing, like Teddy's very, very old, his body is starting to wear out and stop working. Or Teddy's very sick and we can't fix it no matter how hard we try. His body will stop working soon. His body hurts, his body's not working anymore, or saying his body is trying to die. That's something that's happening to him, but it doesn't feel good. So we have to have a doctor help him. And so kind of explaining it in that way, like it's a thing that is happening out of our control and we're going to help it so that it's not as painful for him. So it's sort of a concrete way of describing the intervention piece of euthanasia, which can be very difficult for parents, and sometimes kids can feel like this is something that is being done to their pet, and that's a really difficult thing for them to wrestle with. So really helping them understand that this is happening, you know, they are dying, but it really doesn't feel good. It hurts, their body hurts, so we're going to help him so that it doesn't hurt. And then it's also important, and this seems very, you know, basic, but that's important in this situation. When an animal dies, their body stops working and their heart stops beating. And having parents explain that to kids is really important. What does it mean when an animal dies or when someone dies? It means their heart stops working, their lungs stop working, you know, they stop breathing air. Those sort of things are so concrete that it's almost uncomfortable to say them out loud. And it seems so blunt and harsh, and we wouldn't really speak like that to other adults. But for kids, it's really important. It's how they learn and understand what's happening. There's a book that does this especially well that we have in one of the later slides that I'll point out too, but it just really shares the facts about death and what happens. So we want to avoid euphemisms. In general, I would say when we talk to kids, we want to avoid euphemisms, but we want to especially avoid the phrase putting a pet to sleep. And I know that's, you know, what most adults say, and that's okay, but the reason we want to avoid it for kids is that it can be kind of confusing. If Buddy is put to sleep, but never wakes up and is gone forever, that can cause a child to wonder, well, what happens when I go to sleep tonight? Or I don't want my mom to go to sleep if that means she's never coming back. It can just really make things blurry for them. Like, what does it mean? If they're going to sleep, are they going to wake up? And what does this mean for everyone else I love that sleeps every day? And so that's something that is a little fuzzy for them. And we want to try to avoid using that phrase when possible and use more concrete phrases. And again, feel free to jump in if any questions come up along the way. I can't see the chat, but hopefully, Rebecca, you might be able to see it.
I'll bring your attention to it. If anything pops in, I've got my chat window open.
So with cremation, like Rebecca mentioned, this is a really tough one, and it's tough sometimes to even explain the process to parents. With kids, it can be even more difficult because it's really not what we think of as, like a beautiful or peaceful process. I mean, we know that, of course, it can be, but for children, it can be a very scary concept. They might also ask a lot of questions about what happens to a body after death. That's totally normal, especially in that like 7 to 11 age group. That can be kind of hard and disturbing for parents because this was their pet that they also loved, and they don't want to think, they go to great lengths sometimes not to think about what happens to their pet's body after death. So then they have their child asking these difficult questions, and it can be a tough thing for parents. So giving some of this in terms of recommendations or in any sort of resources that you provide parents can be really helpful. Like Rebecca said earlier, making sure adults understand, making sure you understand the cremation process is the first step, making sure the adults there understand it, and then encouraging them, to explain in concrete language what it is to their child. So we do want to remember that the tone and how we say things matters a lot. So if we say, Teddy's body is going to stop working soon, versus saying that in just a very gentle, reassuring way, it has a very different connotation for kids. So much of it is in our tone and kind of getting on their level, using your soft voice and kind of soft body language is really important when you're using this phrasing. When it comes to cremation, even though we've said use very concrete, honest language, I will point out that with cremation specifically, the words like fire and burning can be associated with danger and fire. I mean, we try to teach kids that fire is bad, don't touch hot things. They have fire drills in school and things like that, so they associate fire with bad things. And so in this case, we do want to soften that just a little bit so they don't think that it's a violent or dangerous or terrible thing that's happening. So saying things like, after Teddy dies, his body will be taken to a special place called a crematory where super hot heat will turn his body into ashes, and kind of giving the information in chunks, starting with that and seeing if they have follow-up questions, and doing that until it feels like their questions are answered is really good approach for parents to take. It's also really important, especially with younger kids, that they know that their pet is dead when they're cremated. And again, that seems just so obvious that we wouldn't even think to say it out loud to anyone, but for kids, if they are not at that age where they understand death is permanent, they may think that this is painful for their pet, or how are they going to look afterwards? How am I going to pet them afterwards? They're just not understanding that that's part of the permanency of death. And so making sure that they know, it's peaceful, and his body's not working anymore, and there's no pain, it doesn't hurt him at all. So that is really important to do. And for parents who are choosing between communal and individual, it's important that they explain to their kids if they are getting ashes back or if they're not, so there are no miscommunications or disappointments. It's also really helpful for parents to include kids in these decisions when it's possible, when it's when the child can understand, especially 7 and older, they can kind of understand what that means. And so involving them in that decision, asking them ahead of time, what they would like to do, I think that's really important about the process. And we usually encourage parents to explain to their child, what's going to happen, the decision making, the euthanasia visit itself, the body care option. and then asking their child how involved they want to be, or giving them some pieces of decision making, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second.
This part I think is so important. No, you could go to the next slide, where you don't, when you're at the appointment, of course, you don't have any ashes back yet, right? Because it takes a week or so to get them back. But it is super helpful to explain to kids what it's going to be like. And therefore, the rest of the people in the room will understand too. I will use words like, it's not like the ashes in your fireplace, or if you had a campfire. It doesn't look anything like those ashes. But if you've ever been to the beach and you've seen seashells that are broken up, that's more what it's going to look like. And so again, making it super concrete and knowing that that the ashes, that my pet's remains are going to come back in a box or a urn of some sort probably feels very strange to kids. That word that you used on the last slide about it can't hurt. After your body has passed away, you don't feel anything anymore. So even during the euthanasia appointment, after the pet dies, I'll often say, you know, we're touching him and petting him. He can't feel us anymore. He's not there. And so I think that hopefully provides comfort for even the parents who probably have a hard time imagining their pet going for cremation as well. Super good advice.
Yeah, and when it comes to, you know, the cremation and the cremains coming back, I think this is a really good opportunity for parents to involve their kids in a kind of lower stake decision. Obviously, younger kids don't really play a role in the decision making of when it's time to euthanize, or the medical, you know, decisions that the parents are making. And so it's hard to help them feel empowered in that part of the process. But afterwards, I think this is such a perfect way for parents to give their child some options, make some decisions that feel right to them. It can really help children feel involved and empowered, and have a better understanding of the process in general. So explaining to kids that some people put their pet's ashes into a pretty container called an urn. I have a picture of our nice wooden urn that we use, and maybe even if your clinic has a standard urn that the family can expect to receive back, kind of showing them what that would look like might be helpful. And then encouraging parents to help kind of open up the discussion with their kids about what should we do with the cremains. Should we leave them in the urn and have that in our house with us all the time? Or do you think there's a place that we should, you know, put Buddy's urn or ashes, cabin, a garden, a lake? A lot of adults, you know, make those decisions without really thinking to include kids, but it's just a really good way for kids to understand and to feel like they're a part of the process. And then also to encourage them to sort of have a ceremony, or, you know, something, make it as important as it is, saying some words or reading a poem, asking kids what they would like to do, including some flowers, that sort of thing. And like Rebecca mentioned, explaining what the ashes will look like, which is important for kids, but this is really important for adults too. A lot of adults don't realize, you know, what the cremains will look like. And you know, we've even had some people call and say, I think there's been a problem. This doesn't look like, you know, what I was expecting, or why are there flecks of green when, you know, in the white bone, and they just are kind of worried that maybe something went wrong, or is this my pet? And so explaining that, or having that printed somewhere so that they know what to expect, is really helpful. And with all of these things, if you're hearing this and you're like, gosh, that would be really hard for me to describe, I don't know, I've never had that discussion before, or that might feel really awkward or outside of my comfort zone, that's a good kind of alert that it could be in writing somewhere that you just give everyone. Then they have it and they can read it when they're ready and if they need it, but you don't have to feel the pressure to somehow explain to every person, you know, what the cremains will look like. So I think that's a good rule of thumb to have that written somewhere. So for families who are burying their pet, this might feel a little bit easier for them to describe, because I think for kids, especially younger kids, this might be just what they know. They cremation might be a very new idea for them, but depending on their family's experience with loved ones passing away or what they've seen on TV or something like that, burial is just sort of a more well-known option after someone passes away. So kids may not have as much confusion about this, but they may still have those morbid questions, which can be really, difficult for parents to answer. But again, that honest, concrete language is helpful. So when people explain burial, the parents can explain that the pet will be dead when they're buried, not sleeping, which again is really important, especially for those younger kids. They can be encouraged to choose a marker or headstone, or understand that a marker or headstone is important because it shows them where their pet is. They can visit the spot if they would like to. Dirt will cover whatever, coffin or container or blanket that the pet is in, and that grass or flowers will eventually grow on it. So hopefully you're seeing this trend of describing things in a way that is so basic that it just almost wouldn't even cross our mind to go that basic. And it's so not what we're, kind of used to or socialized to do, but it's really important to think as basic as possible. And each thing that you describe, kind of stopping and checking for comprehension. And again, you may not be having these conversations. This may just be part of your recommendation for parents or printed somewhere like in a blog article for parents to read. So before the visit, starting with the receptionist conversation on the phone or a website article or a pre-visit email, encourage families to prepare together. That's really important. And we often say on the phone, is there anything I can do to help you guide your family through this? Or is there anything I can do to help you, prepare your children? If they say yes, some ideas that we can encourage are having family discussions, making sure children are in the loop, thinking about who will be present, taking COVID safety into account, which I'll mention in a second here. They can make a bucket list together for their pet, taking photos with their pet or of their pet, storytelling, writing down their favorite stories, and then making shared decisions when possible. Asking the kids, who would you like to have present? What toys do you think Buddy would like to have near him? Where do you think Buddy would like to be? Those sort of safe decisions that kids can play a role in are really important to include. During the visit, it's really important when you're talking to the family to also include the child by making eye contact, or when you ask the parents, do you have any questions before we move forward or before you leave, and stopping and asking the kids too, do you have any questions for me, or is there anything that you're wondering about? Sometimes I think we're afraid to ask those questions because we're just afraid of what the child might say, which is very normal. They say the darndest things. And so being put on the spot with a difficult question that we don't know how to answer, especially those like spiritual or existential questions, super normal for them to ask that. And of course, take the lead of the family. If they're talking about Buddy going to heaven, of course, use whatever phrasing the family's using that feels right for them. But if they ask, what do you think Buddy will see in heaven? Just kind of turning it back around and saying, that's such a good question. I wonder about that all the time. What do you think? That is just a really good way to answer that. In fact, I often see that when I'm talking to adults who ask me difficult questions about, the existential part of death and spirituality, when you don't know, if it's the same as theirs. And so that's a really good kind of way to turn that back on them. Let them be involved in creative ways. So if they have anything they'd like to say, a letter or poem they wrote, if they have any music they would like to play on their phone, they can bring a special blanket or a special toy, to have near their pet or to send with their pet. And asking the kids questions too. What was Buddy's favorite thing to do when he felt better? Do you remember when you got Buddy? Do you know how he got his name? Asking some of those questions is a good way to include them so that they feel empowered. And of course, some kids are just shy and they do not want to talk to a stranger or answer questions, and that's okay too. But doing some things like that sprinkled into the visit, it sends the message to the parents that you're a safe person that understands what this is like for them, and you can answer questions beyond just, what's happening with their pet, and kind of help guide them through that. And it also sends the message to kids that you are a safe person and they can ask you questions about what they're seeing. So after the email, I think it's really helpful to send a supportive email with some resources, or somehow include resources in the condolence card. Even just a simple Word document that you can print out and fold in half and include in the condolence card might be something that you can do. It doesn't have to be super high tech at all. Having a blog post or a resource page on your website is good. You can, of course, always direct people to our website. We have lots of blog articles and resources for parents. So including children in the condolence cards is really important too. So when you write out, you know, the dear so-and-so family, include the kids' names too. And then have some printable resources on your website if you're able to. Some examples would be a conversation prompt for parents, a letter for a child's school or teacher, which we have a copy on our website of that, coloring activities, book recommendations, a principal outline of developmental stages. All of those things are really good things for parents to have. And the more you make available on your website or printed, the less you feel like you have to fill in all of those gaps of education, which is just sometimes impossible to do in the brief interaction that you have. So a couple things about COVID-19. I know this is kind of taking away everything that we've thought about today and encouraged, and families are having a harder time staying together to say goodbye. And I think that's, in the veterinary field anyway, I feel like that is just one of the most heartbreaking pieces of what COVID has done. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that and just know, you know, we are all doing the best we can to keep everyone safe, and it won't be like this forever. And so we might just have to get a little bit creative in the meantime, improving pre and post visit communication. So you're helping to prepare families before the visit and helping to support them afterwards. So thinking about your communication touch points, the phone call, the website, their Google searches, your social media pages, if you send a confirmation email, if you send a follow-up email, a condolence card, all of those communication touch points, you can think creatively about how to encourage, you know, entire family involvement or include kids. You can be prepared with technology suggestions, especially right now with kids being home from college. We especially don't want an entire family maybe present in the room. That just increases the danger a bit with COVID. And so when we have to limit people, but there's a kid home from college who really wants to be involved, that's a good time to suggest Zoom or FaceTime phone conversations. I know it's not the same, and it's important to acknowledge that we realize that is just not at all the same as what we wish could happen, but it's something that you can offer that they maybe hadn't thought of. And then think about what else you can do after the visit to support the family. Sending a really, you know, personalized condolence card with some sort of insert for resources, sending an email, even if you use a similar template for a lot of families and just personalize it based on the visit, that can help it be more manageable for your team to do. Having printed resources, an information card, referring them to support groups, there are a lot of things that we can do after that haven't been impacted by COVID. In fact, some of these things we might be creative and add now and decide to keep them forever. And so that might be just an overall improvement. I know certainly at Minnesota Pets, we've come up with some things that we were like, why weren't we doing this before COVID? And we'll never stop doing it. So there are some, you know, maybe silver linings that we can get from it. But above all, you know, it's important to acknowledge it for each family you work with and for yourself. This is really hard. This is not the way we wish it could go, and it won't be like this forever.
So the thing, kind of the takeaway, I think, for this information is that there's a lot to talk about in every appointment. There's a lot of things to talk about if we're including cremation and body care options and whatnot. This to me is an easy takeaway list that somebody on your team could just write into a blog article or some sort of informational article that you have that you include for every single euthanasia appointment that you have identified the family has children. So these are the recommendations that we would share. So if a pet owner is a parent and they say, yeah, I really could use some help knowing what to say with my kids, this is the bullet list. So I would just flesh this in on your team, take a snapshot of this slide and just put it into an article or a blog article that you can post. then you don't have to talk about it and go through every single thing. If somebody really needed extra help and information, you could walk through it with them. But this would be information I would share with every family. And at Minnesota Pets early on, we did a really deep dive to find what are all the books that are available to help support parents. I know as a parent, I reach for books very often when we're dealing with something that's either difficult or unfamiliar and new. And thankfully, there's books out there for many different age groups. And these are just a couple of the pictures of the ones that we really like. My personal favorite is the one at the bottom, The Dragonfly, which I can't even read it because I don't have my glasses on. Hold on, let me put them on. The Dragonfly Door. It's a really cool, like, metaphorical kind of analogy for what death is. And I read the book for the very first time. I was like, oh, that is a fantastic explanation, even for us as adults. So my suggestion would be just go to Amazon and get some used copies. Just get a bunch of them. Have them on your shelf in whatever room you use for euthanasia, or even if you have a special section that makes sense in your front waiting area, and kind of put some title up there about when it's time, you know, when you're experiencing loss or whatever. And if you just make these loaners to your clients, who cares if it doesn't come back? It's all right, it's $5, you can get another one or whatever. But let them kind of take a look and see. I would even put on the front cover, like, this is appropriate for ages 4 to 8 or whatever, because some of these clearly are written for very young children. What was hard for us is finding resources for teens, because that's just not an audience, for whatever reason, that very many authors have reached out to with resources. But you can go to our website. We've got listings there for teenagers as well as for adults, because it just sometimes helps in those overwhelming moments after this is all over. What do I do with all this feeling that I have, which is much more intense than I thought I was going to experience? And it ebbs and flows. It comes back again. So have some book resources available. Just make it easy for your families and parents to pick out one that they might want to bring home, or at least just jot down the name or take a picture so they can get it themselves from the bookstore.
Yes, and we have a printable resource list. We have a lot of these resources on our website. We do have a few of the books appropriate for teenagers on our website too. And then that earlier printout, we had talked about the ages and stages and the breakdown of grief, you know, according to age. I'm happy to email you any of those handouts. So feel free to email me at this email address here on the screen. I'm happy to share any of this. And we have all of these resources on our website too. So regardless of if a client used our services or not, we want to share them with whoever might need them. So if they said goodbye to their pet in your clinic, of course, still feel free to use any of our grief resources. We also have a grief series on our website, on our resource page. Parents can sign up for an email series, and they get a series of 10 emails over 10 days. And it just kind of guides them through the first 10 days after their family's loss of their pet, how they can support their kids, some really concrete, you know, actions they can do, conversation prompts, and that sort of thing. So definitely feel free to offer that to your clients or to sign up for it yourself if you would ever need that too. So that's all we have. I know we went over for a few minutes, so thank you for bearing with us. It's a lot to fit in, but if anyone has any follow-up questions about Minnesota Pets or about this topic and how you can help families, definitely feel free to reach out.
Perfect. So we can open it up for a couple of minutes. If anybody does have any questions, please enter those into the chat box and we'll definitely address them. In the meantime, our next session will be Thursday, January 28th, 2021, and that will be titled Anatomy of a Phone Call. And a link to that will be included in the email when I send out the CE certificates.
Christy, while we're waiting, if people have questions, it's kind of a quirky title for one of our talks. Can you give the 30-second summary? What does that mean, anatomy of a phone call?
Yes, so the anatomy of the phone call talk will be about how to deliver a supportive conversation with a client, whether you're scheduling or answering questions, while also balancing efficiency, which I know is just constant battle in a busy clinic. And so I think especially right now it's important because your frontline receptionist team is having a lot of conversations that are extra difficult due to COVID. So we'll kind of go over some ways that they can be, extraordinarily compassionate and also efficient in getting clients what they need.
It might be worth, Sarah, in the announcement for that next talk, just making sure that people catch that it's front desk receptionist or anybody who's involved on their team in answering the phone. If you
Perfect.
don't ever answer the phone on your team, it may not be as relevant for you unless you train others on how to do that. And so
That is a fantastic idea. And I'm not seeing any questions come through. So I just want to thank you two for joining us today. And we will see you next year.
we really appreciate it, Sarah. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.